Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this conference today on the legacy of the July 15 coup attempt on civil-military and U.S.-Turkey relations. As you all know, yesterday, July 15th, was the second anniversary of the coup attempt in 2016, and many things have happened since then over the past 2 years. And we thought of organizing this conference to see what kind of changes may have occurred in terms of civil-military relations in Turkey, but also on the U.S.-Turkey relations front. The first panel, this one, is going to focus on the civil-military relations, but in Turkey, but also sort of from the American perspective, how civil-military relations are supposed to be or supposed to happen. Later on at noon, we are going to listen to a keynote address by the deputy chairperson of the AK party, Dr. Ravza Kavakçıkan. And in the afternoon at 1:30, there will be a second panel titled The Future of the U.S.-Turkey Security Partnership. So as you know, 2 years ago on July 15th, there was a coup attempt by a terror organization, basically a clique within the army that failed to take over the power. You all saw the videos and photos and all the debates about how Turkish people took the streets, especially following President Erdogan's call on them to reclaim their democratically elected institutions. And it was a fateful night. 250 people gave their lives. Thousands have been injured. And this really represented a unique challenge for Turkey. As you all know, Turkey experienced a lot of many military interventions, soft and hard, but this was a particularly unique one. So I'll stop there. I won't say a lot more, but we thought it important to focus on what kind of legacy this will have on the Turkish democracy and its relationship with the West, in particular with the US. So without further ado, I want to turn to my left to Sener Akturk. Sener Akturk is an associate professor with Koç University in Turkey, Department of International Relations. We appreciate him traveling to the US basically for this conference. We have had him back in 2010 and 2013, earlier in his career. He's a scholar of comparative politics. He focuses on Germany, Turkey, Russia, and he has many published books. He's published for Inside Turkey, SETA's publication as well on in particular this coup issue. To his left, we have Edward Erickson. He's a Colonel Erickson and retired as professor of military history at the Commandant Staff College, Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. He now serves as a scholar in residence at the Clark Center for Global Engagement at the State University of New York at Cortland, New York. Of course, he has a distinguished military career, long resume. I'm not going to read it for time, but not out of lack of respect. So thank you for for being here with us. To his left, Mark Perry. First of all, he's a great friend of ours. He's a great historian of the U.S. military. He's published 10 books on the U.S. military subject, and he's working with us on a piece on Turkey as well. We asked him once again to come and comment on how things look from the U.S. military's perspective, also U.S. civil military relationships. So we appreciate all three panelists being here in the middle of summer. So, Dr. Akturk, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. I will have a number of comments on the coup, on civil-military relations, and if I still have time, one comment on Turkish-American-Russian relations at the very end. I will not say anything that I have not published. So if you are interested in any part of it, this is kind of the culmination of 7 different publications over the last 3 years. I can give you the exact references and email them in PDF if you like. First of all, July is a fateful month in the sense that Turkey did not face only 1, but 2 totalitarian assaults between July 2015 and July 2016. In July 11, 2015, PKK declared that it's ending the ceasefire against Turkey. 3 days later, in July 14, 2015, almost exactly 1 year before the failed coup attempt, PKK declared that it is resuming People's Revolutionary War against Turkey, which then initiated the deadliest episode in the last 15, 16 years when over 1,000 people, overwhelmingly civilians, were killed in Turkey, including in mass suicide bombings by the PKK in Istanbul, Ankara, and other major metropolitan urban centers. Just as this fight ended with decisive victory of the Turkish military, it was already in its last phases in the late spring, early summer of 2016. We had another totalitarian attempt that is by the esoteric messianic religious cult of Fethullah Gulen and his Gulenist supporters in the military staged the failed coup of July 15, 2016, which is the occasion, the second commemoration of which motivates the current panel. Now, the reason I mention these two and I discuss them together is not just because they happened almost 1 year after each other, but because the causes are also similar. This is what I want to say in a sentence. Both terrorist organizations, PKK and its Syrian branch, but especially its Turkish core branch, but also the Gulenists faced existential threats as a result of Turkey's democratization of the last 10 years. What I mean is that every terrorist organization exploits a real grievance in society. PKK exploited the prohibitions on the expression of Kurdish ethnic linguistic identity, and Gulenists exploited the grievance from that grew as a result of restrictions on Islamic religiosity. That's why Gulenism is one of the most extreme forms of public dissimulation. Right? You almost absolutely cannot recognize a Gulenist if he or she doesn't want to disclose himself or herself, because there is nothing that reveals a religious conservative orientation outwardly. Right? Beard, set scarves, dress, etc. Both of these illegal, clandestine, cult-like, and both of them are very much cult-like, right? The Gulen cult and the Öcalan cult, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but both of them faced an existential threat because starting especially in 2004 and peaking after 2009, 2010, AK Party governments in Turkey lifted restrictions on the public expression of Kurdish identity and Islamic religious identity. So there are many legislative reforms. The most popular and internationally known ones are the lifting of the headscarf ban in the universities, in bureaucracy, eventually in the police force, judiciary, and the military, so in every public sector, but it has happened gradually. And the restrictions on the Kurdish language have been lifted. Once upon a time, right in 1980s, ministers in the cabinet could be put in prison for stating that there is a Kurdish people. Now, for the last decade almost, the Turkish state funds a public TV channel that is only in Kurdish. every public school in Turkish offers elective Kurdish language courses. So Kurdish language, both in public schools, in public television, and other funded through the public budget, received expression. So both of these reforms, in a way, undercut the grievance, the swamp from which Gulenists and the PKK could recruit terrorist militants, right? So in the long term, with Islamic religiosity and Kurdish ethnic linguistic identity being freely expressed in the public, the raison d'etre, right, the justification, the reason for PKK and Gulenists, even for their hardcore supporters, were vanishing, the new generations. So sooner or later, and this is what I call Turkey's civil rights movement against which the coup was launched, and that was the title of the Inside Turkey article, which is also included in this book, which is available also in display, July 5th Coup Attempt. Turkey's civil rights movement, which the PKK and the Gulenists, with their declaration of war and then the failed coup attempt, tried to derail. My third point on this is that there's another interesting coincidence. Both PYD, PKK, and the Gulenists were against Turkey's democratizing role in the Arab Spring, especially in Syria. One example from each group. A critical turning point was the July 2013 military coup against Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. Gulenists condoned and some of them openly justified and supported the coup, whereas the overwhelming majority of the Turkish public, including the government and many of the major political parties, sided with the democratically elected government and president of Egypt, who, by the way, is the only democratically elected president of Egypt in over 5,000 years of Egyptian history, and he's in jail in terrible health condition, might even die in jail because of mistreatment. So that, for example, shows very different reading of the Arab Spring. Similarly, in Syria, PYD, which officially is inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, right? PKK says it's continuing the legacy of the October Revolution, the Soviet legacy, Leninist party, right? What I call the Kurdish Soviet experiment in Syria, established a one-party dictatorship in northwestern Syria, not tolerating other ethnic groups, but not even tolerating religious conservative Kurds. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds fled the PYD regime in Syria for Turkey. Even the elder brother of Salih Muslim, the leader of PYD, is a refugee in Turkey because he cannot live under his brother's regime because he's a religious conservative Kurd, and the PYD with its Bolshevik ideology does not tolerate conservative Kurds or Arabs or Turkmens and whatnot. So there too, Turkey was siding with the majority of the Syrian people, Turkmens, Kurds, Arabs, Sunni Muslims, whatnot, organized in different factions of the Free Syrian Army, but also other groups, and with its military and political initiatives kept supporting that, whereas PYD, in actually some sort of having reached a modus vivendi with the Assad regime in Damascus, PYD and the Assad regime, both of which are minority dictatorships in essence, ethnic, sectarian, ideological minorities within the Syrian population, supported by the Russian Air Force and the Iranian ground forces, basically. So that was another major reason, a foreign geopolitical one, that put PKK, PYD, and the Gulenists in opposition to the Turkish governments. That's all I want to say about the coup and the comments on the coup. Next up, on civil-military relations. Now, there have been a number of, because how can we assess civil-military relations as outsiders, right? I don't have insider knowledge, neither many of us. So we can only judge it on the basis of objective criteria that are available in public. For example, publicized disputes between the civilian and the military leadership. And in all the major civilian-military disputes over the last decade, the civilian government prevailed, which is also quite unprecedented. There are many, I'll only cite one domestic organizational dispute and one foreign policy type of dispute. when the Turkish government decided to lift the headscarf ban also in the military, which was the very last stage of the lifting of the ban, because it was first lifted in the universities and bureaucracy, then in the judiciary, then in the police force, and finally for the officers, for the women officers in the military. There was resentment. We know it because it was reflected in even high-profile newspaper articles and interviews, as you read, right? But the reform went ahead, and its critics were, either went ahead or maybe they resigned or were dismissed. That's a domestic organizational example. There are many others. I mean, the military high command is now subordinated directly to the Department of Defense, which was finalized just 2 days ago, and many other similar reforms in the organizational structure of the military and its relationship with the civilian leadership. In all of these turning points, the civilian government prevailed over some critics in the military. There seems to have been, at least in the past, disagreement on the Syria policy as well, right? And the general geopolitical, grand strategy of Turkey as it was shaping up. I have written on, for example, pro-Russian Turkish Eurasianists, right, who favor Russia as Turkey's number one ally, and they are overrepresented. They were at least historically overrepresented in the Turkish military from all the open sources that we have. In fact, that's also an article I published, the most popular article in Turkish studies, I'm happy to say. But Turkey did not pursue, right, a pro-Assad, pro-Russian foreign policy with regards to Syria at all. Quite the opposite. Right? The Turkish military and its proxies and allies, the Free Syrian Army and others in Syria have been the primary, representative of the mostly Syrian Arab Sunni majority opposition to the Assad regime, but also to the Kurdish socialist militants known as the PYD. So whether it is organizational issues such as headscarf in the military or geopolitical military operational decisions, the civilian leadership seems to have prevailed in its decisions over the military. Which brings me to the fifth point, most important legacy of July 15, the title of today's panel for me, is that democracy as a regime type and resistance to a military coup became part of Turkey's national identity, part of its national heritage, part of its officially celebrated, national holidays. This is a first, right? Of course, there are many national commemorations, the national struggle against the French and Greek and British occupation forces, commemoration of the death of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and whatnot. But this is the first and only national commemoration in the name of democracy as a regime type of 240 people who have been martyred fighting against the coup plotters. This is important because this is a popular threshold. Any other, if there is any other, there have been failed military coup attempts in Turkish history in 1963, 62. Many people wouldn't know, but none of them used violence to this extent, not at all. And this coup attempt, despite mass use of violence, hundreds of people killed, still failed due in great part to popular mobilization, which means that there is now a very high threshold for any aspiring military dictator or coup plotter in the future, because he has to think that what has happened in July 15 could repeat with even worse consequences for the coup plotters if it's ever attempted again. So this may have, hopefully it did, but it may have closed the door on military coups in Turkish history. My penultimate point on this, despite the fact that out of approximately 350 generals and admirals in the Turkish military, 150 were dismissed after the coup. That's 42% of the military high command. Many speculated, for some critics of Turkey, I suspect that was also wishful thinking on their part, that the Turkish military is somehow crippled or operationally incapable as a result of these dismissals. But if there was any such illusion, it must have been dispelled. The month after the coup, Turkish military launched Operation Euphrates Shield against Daesh, ISIS, liberating Azez, Mara, Dabuk, El-Bab, and Dabuk, of course, has significant ideological, eschatological significance for ISIS because they think it has to do something with the end of times and the final battles, etc. So it broke the back of the Turkish military, broke the back of ISIS in August, September 2016, right after a major military coup attempt, then the dismissal of 42% of the generals and admirals. And earlier this year, again, the Turkish military successfully defeated and cleansed and liberated Afrin in northwestern Syria from PYD. And Afrin, of all the so-called cantons, is the one symbolically, ideologically, demographically most important for PYD in the sense that it's the oldest one. It's one that Öcalan spent time in. It's the most mountainous one. It has a huge Kurdish population and so on and so forth. In a way, it's the least likely case of a military success, demonstrating that if Turkish military can so easily liberate Afrin, it can even more easily liberate Tel Abyad, Raqqa, Haseke, all of these territories that are almost entirely, if not overwhelmingly, Sunni Arab majority with very little Kurdish minority, let alone Kurdish socialists, which is the main support base for the PYD. Finally, I think this is also good for civil-military relations from a theoretical and practical point of view, and here I'll give a reference to an American scholar of civil-military relations, Michael Desch, who argued, and I completely agree, that militaries that focus on internal threats and non-military tasks, such as fighting narcotics or narcotic trade or internal subversion, are more likely to get involved in politics, and which leads to terrible civil-military relations, whereas militaries that focus on external threats and purely military missions, this is the best scenario for civilian subordination, military subordination to civilian rule. And this is where Turkey has been headed for the last 2 years. Military's primary and more or less only occupation is fighting first ISIS, then PYD, PKK in northeastern Syria, and then in northern Iraq with great success. And that is a good structural foundation for democratic civil-military relations, focus on external threats rather than internal threats. The unfortunate turn in Turkish-American relations will be my last sentence comment here, because it's also the topic, as I understand, of a second panel in the afternoon. Actually, by 2015, from a neo-realist point of view, to which I subscribe, there were great structural conditions for a reinvigorated Turkish-American alliance. Why? Because Russia invaded Georgia in the Five-Day War, 2008. Russia invaded, occupied and annexed Crimea in 2014. That is, becoming hegemonic in the Black Sea, a naval hegemon again. And in September 2015, Russian Air Force entered into Syria. Those are three key countries to Turkey's left, to Turkey's east, north, and south. So in all three sides, except for west, Turkey was being surrounded, encircled by Russian military hegemony. So this is, in a way, could bring us back to the Cold War, where United States and Britain and the Western Alliance could apply, could seek to balance Russian expansion in the Crimea, in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in Syria. It didn't happen, but that's an American decision, right? That it didn't happen. I questioned that even at the time. Why isn't it happening? Why is what happened in Korea and elsewhere during the Cold War isn't happening in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Syria. It could be the Iran deal. It could be all kinds of things. United States decision makers, I guess, decided at the time that neither Ukraine, nor Georgia, nor Syria, nor Crimea, nor Abkhazia are important national security threats or assets for the United States. So they didn't do anything in terms of military political deterrence. Economic sanctions, sure. But how effective those are is a different question. But then what changed from Turkish point of view is that these Russian expansionist moves are still potential external threats, right? Yes, Russian hegemony in the Black Sea is bad compared to Ukrainian possession of Crimea, or Russian military bombing Tbilisi, south of Caucasus is bad. But in 2000, and I come to the first sentence of my presentation, it will be a good wrap up. Between July 2015, PKK declaring all-out attack against Turkey with suicide bombers and whatnot for an entire year, and then Gülen's coup attempt in July 2016, internal security threat far exceeded any external Russian and other threat that Turkey ever faced. Why that was terrible for U.S. Turkish-American relations is because both of these organizations, PKK, PYD, and the Gülenis, were seen by the overwhelming majority, 80–90% of the Turkish public, as being directly supported by the United States. U.S. military and Air Force supports PYD in Syria and supplies tons of weapons. And the Gülenist leader and the leading cadres are in the United States, in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So the number one and number two internal security threats to Turkey in Istanbul, in Ankara, not in Georgia, not in Crimea, but in Istanbul, Ankara, Diyarbakir, and elsewhere, were seen as American proxies. And that motivated Turkey, understandably, to seek rapprochement with other great powers and regional powers, not seeing the support it was expecting in its fight against PKK or the Gülenis. Thank you very much for your patience. I'll be happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Akturk. Please, Dr. Erickson.
Okay. Unlike my colleague, I've not written about any of this stuff. So this is just kind of rubbish coming out of my head. Some ideas that I've had, and I'm approaching this panel as a historian. How might a military historian assess civil-military relations over the past 20, 25 years in Turkey, and how does the coup intersect with this? France is on its fifth republic. France has had 5 major constitutional changes since 1792, 1793 in its constitution. I would throw out the idea Turkey is in its second republic. Two reasons why: the presidential system, major structural change. The second is the assertion of civilian control over the military. This is a huge deal. So I think Turkey is now in what we would fairly call the second republic. When Americans think about civil-military relations, what do they mean exactly? In 1957, a guy named Samuel P. Huntington wrote a seminal book called The Soldier and the State: The Theory and Politics of Civil-Military Relations. So Huntington's book, The Soldier and the State, defined and established a vocabulary and a framework for thinking about civil-military relations. And this was a crucial period in our history. Mark is going to talk more about the United States' approach to this. But Huntington and people like him were concerned about the American military assuming a dominant role in domestic politics, and in particular military-industrial complex issues of that sort. So what Huntington said was, in our history, the United States history, the establishment of objective civilian control over military institutions was an important part of defining what a democracy is. And in particular, that militaries did not interfere with domestic politics, and that militaries did not become too powerful in government policy. So that's where Huntington was going in 1957. It's a huge deal in any discussions of democratization of authoritarian societies. It's a huge deal in general discussions about democracy as an institution anyways. So what happens in Turkey? The military calls the shots. The military runs Turkey pretty much up into the early part of the 20th century. not running every single day, but interfering with policy decisions. There are 3 coups. There's a silent coup in 1997. And the Turkish General Staff, in particular the Kurmay Subay, who run that organization, stepped in to change the direction Turkey was going domestically. And I appreciate the comments about the nuances between domestic and foreign policy, because this is an important thing. What changes in Turkey? Up until 2004, the protocol list in Ankara, the Chief of the General Staff is number 3, behind the President, the Prime Minister, and the Chief of the General Staff. The Minister of Defense, number 13. Number 13. Let that sink in for just a minute. In the protocol list, Minister of Defense, who on the organizational chart of democratic countries is the boss of the Chief of the General Staff, it's reversed, and not reversed like number 4 or 5, but way down. So that's what happens in the protocol list. That defines the relationship, I think, between the Chief of the General Staff and the Ministry of Defense that he ostensibly works for. Why does this change? Why are there no coups after 2000? I think if you go back and look at who was the Chief of the General Staff, how does a coup start? Who has to be in bed with the conspirators? Who has to be, if not a co-conspirator, at least somebody who looks the other way, or an enabler, perhaps? The Chief of the General Staff. The last couple Kemalists, in my view, General Karadaya and General Kavırkoglu, both of those guys born in the early 1930s. That takes us up to 2000. Those are the Kavırkoglu and Karadaya, the last deputy and chief Turkish land force commander who were able to overthrow a government by coup. And as you remember, Necmettin Erbakan and the Welfare Party, the Refah Party, were put out of office. 2000 occurs. What happens in 2000? Younger men born after 1940 now reach the level of Chief of the General Staff. Hilmi Özkök, born in 1940. Büyük Kanıt, born in 1940. Başbuğ, born in 1943. Koşener, born in 1945. Özel, 1950. Akar, 1952. And Güler, the latest one, in 1954. You go back to Özkök, Hilmi Özkök. He was 20 years old in 1980. He was 20 years old in 1980. So the new century Chiefs of the General Staff saw coups in action. And they saw the reaction, and they saw the imposition of martial law. More importantly, those younger guys, those new guys, had a lot of NATO assignments. They're much more fluent in English than their predecessors. They served in Brussels, they served in Mons, they served in Naples, they served in NATO assignments. Some of them came here and were graduates of the Army War College at Carlisle. So there's a sea change, I think, in the background and education of the 21st century Chiefs of the General Staff. It starts in 2004, 2005 with the advent of the AKP taking over politically. And these men kind of let Prime Minister, then President, then Prime Minister again, Erdogan, impose checks and balances on what the military did. As we slide into 2012 with the Balyoz and Ergenekon cases, a lot of serving generals and admirals are put in prison. A lot of recent retirees, Başbuğ, I think, goes to prison. Influential, important senior officers who might have delayed or slowed down the tempo, the pace of President Erdogan's actions were marginalized. Coming out of that into 2012, now we get into, as we've learned already and know, the PKK crisis and the coup of 2016. What does the coup do? It's already in motion. The idea of civilian control, instituting true civilian control in Turkey has been going on for some time. What does the coup actually do? It accelerates the process. It is an overnight change in the ability of President Erdogan to point to the military, to point to to the impact, to the effect of the Glenn organization to influence some military members. A lot of, you know, the relief of 42% of the flag officers, all of whom are Kurmaisubai, all of whom are coming out of the War College. And so some things start to happen. The War College, the Staff College, the military academies are closed. In 2016, the Supreme Military Committee, the Supreme Military Council, which was always pretty much an internal, the military told the civilians who was going to reach the high levels of command. The composition changes of that council. And all of a sudden, you have not just the prime minister in this, but you've got the minister of defense, you've got the foreign minister, you've got the minister of the interior, and several other civilians who are now looking very hard post-coup at, and when the dust settles, who are the military who supported the government? Who didn't, when the chips were down, who didn't chicken out and go with the pushtas, with the coup plotters? And we have, of course, Hulusi Akar emerging. Hulusi, the most important person, I think, in the whole scheme of the coup may be Hulusi Akar, because he didn't go he obviously didn't know about the coup, but when he's offered the opportunity to throw his hat in with the coup plotters, he doesn't do it, and he sticks with the government. He does what Americans, what Western Europeans, what Turks who are interested in advancing democratic ideals in Turkey would aspire to, and that's to reject the coup, to continue loyalty to Erdogan, to the government, to the legitimately elected leaders of the country. That's a key piece of this, and I throw it out that one guy. Does anybody have a chance to throw the coup into the successful execution mode? And I think it was probably Akar. We can talk about that. So subsequently, what we have now, in just yesterday and Sunday, is the establishment of the presidential system, formally putting the Ministry of Defense over the Chief of the General Staff. It's long overdue. It ratifies what has been in place since 2016, but it's an important development, I think, for Turkey. Good thing, bad thing. I'm a Kemalist. I like what Mustafa Kemal did for Turkey. I like the 6 arrows. I like modernization. I like westernization. I like secularization. So part of me misses the Kemalist bent, the Kemalist part of what the Turkish military used to do. The realistic side of me, the democratic side of me, thinks right now that Turkey's heading in the right direction. This had to be done. They had to exert full civilian control over the military. On the path they were in, it was gradual. It would not have occurred for some years. The coup has accelerated that and made a de facto event formally law and a habit, practice in Turkey. So I'm happy with, I'm pleased with the direction Turkey is going in this regard. I think that's about all I want to say. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Erickson. Mark.
I like Kemal too. I like Ataturk. I like him. But people talk about civil-military relations in the United States all the time, and they talk as if they know what it means and where it came from, and nobody really does, I don't think. We have a long tradition of military subservience to civilian control, but I defy anyone to name a date from which that took place. Why has it always been there? What happened? In preparing for this panel, I tried to answer the question. I came up with a fairly well-known incident to historians of American history, and that took place in 1782 in Newburgh, New York, where the Continental Army was encamped. This was a pretty ragtag, ragamuffin group of guys who had not been paid in a long time, and they were on the verge of mutiny. And they issued a petition. The officers of the various Continental Army regiments issued a petition calling for the Continental Congress to immediately pay the Army what it was owed, and threatening, in so many words, a coup if their demands were not met. The subsequent history has showed that General Horatio Gates and his officers were probably behind this in an attempt to kind of undermine George Washington, the commanding general, and to throw into question his leadership. And so Washington hustled off to Newburgh, to the encampment, and strode into a room in the midst of a meeting about the petition. This is March 1782. And Washington stood up in front of his officers in a room of quite upset soldiers and gave a speech. Taking over the podium from General Gates. And he pleaded with them to stop their mutiny and to drop their demands and to follow his example of dutiful responsibility to the duly elected representatives of the colonies. In closing, this is from a historian, Michael Hattem of Yale University. In closing, Washington told the officers that he wished to read them a recent supportive letter from Joseph Jones, a congressman from Virginia. However, Washington's vision had recently begun to fail. After stumbling through the first paragraph, he reached in his pocket for a pair of spectacles, comme ça, and put them on. And he remarked offhandedly, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in service to my country." And that was the end of that coup. Officers only wept, the petition was dropped, and George Washington, our Ataturk, confirmed complete civilian control of the military, even if the military was not paid. And that is how civilian control of the military began in the United States and has continued in the United States from the example of Washington. But there are other factors at issue here. The Continental Army and the US Army, as it was at the time, was not a modernizing factor in American society. The modernizing and sophisticated factors in American society were in the Continental Congress. The Continental Army was hillbilly elegy of the 18th century. Farmers and small businessmen, not planters. Washington was a planter. He wasn't a military man, he was a wannabe military man. This is a man who wanted to be an officer in the British Army when he began his career. He wasn't a highly trained, sophisticated soldier. He wasn't Kemal Ataturk. He was George Washington. And he rose to prominence in a society that had no Kurdish separatism, did not need modernizing, was not shot through with political Islam, didn't have an education problem, wasn't upset by, in the 1980s, there was a 1980 coup in Turkey, as I recall, right? September 1980. Was not shot through with incredible violence, where hundreds died every day. It was a far different society. So when I hear people come to me and say, well, you know, these Turks, they've got to learn about this civil military stuff. They've got to follow the model set by the Americans. And it's not so easily done. But it was done in the United States because we actually, despite all the enormous differences during the American Revolution among the population of the United States, it was a pretty coherent society. One religion, no separatism, you don't count the slaveholders. So, you know, this is a quite different history. And it stood the test of time. 51, I'll give you, that's the first thing I have to say. Here's the second thing I have to say. It's not as if we haven't had our civil military relations put to the test. I'm old enough to remember that 51 years ago next week, July 23rd, 1967, the Detroit police broke up a drinking party at a place called the Blind Pig in Detroit. For me, this looms as a very large event. You go ask people in the United States about Detroit 1967, they probably don't, most don't remember, but for my generation, I remember it was vivid what happened. The Detroit police invaded the Blind Pig, it's a drinking party in downtown Detroit, African-American mostly, and arrested 80 guys, who knows why, just arrested them. And rioting broke out. And it was one serious riot, a race riot. And over the next 3 or 4 days, 82 people in Detroit were, 80 were killed, shot by the police. And it was out of control. Within 24 hours, the Detroit police could not handle the rioting. And Detroit was on fire. And the governor of Michigan was George Romney, the father of Mitt Romney. And he decided to deploy the Michigan National Guard to Detroit to end the rioting. They didn't. The citizens of Detroit, in their wisdom, decided to fire on the National Guard. That's no longer a riot. That's an insurrection. People ask, what really changed in America in your lifetime? Civil rights, the Voting Rights Act. Forget the Voting Rights Act. When your cities are on fire, that changes things. And Lyndon Johnson, sitting in the White House, decided he would, instead of deploying the 82nd Airborne to Vietnam, he'd deploy them to Detroit. And because the National Guard in Michigan couldn't handle what was going on in Detroit, so the 82nd Airborne landed and the rioting stopped. People of Detroit, fire on the Michigan National Guard, the all-white Michigan National Guard, but they weren't about to fire on the 82nd Airborne, whose enlisted personnel at the time were 20% African American. Because the American military then, and you could argue still, represents America in all walks of life, race, gender, ethnic background. Our military represents our country in very fundamental ways. There's a little bit of a debate now about whether that's still true and how we could bring it back a little bit to more representative, but in general terms, for 240 or 50 years, our military has represented America. If you look at Turkish history, that's simply not true. The Turkish military might represent what is best in Turkey. You can make the argument. I certainly defer to Turkish patriots on that score. But Turkey is a very, very different society than the United States of America. And that matters. So when people walk up to me and say, well, the Turks need to learn, we need to learn. And what we need to learn is that when societies are plunged in violence, which is it's not out of the question in America, certainly, given our history. When there are separatist elements in a society, when a society is plunged into violence, when a society has deep economic divisions, the prominence of a military as a stabilizing force, as a kind of default position for solutions, is perfectly understandable. That's number two. Number three, I agree with my colleagues about a threshold being passed in Turkey. I think the July 15th coup. Well, take a look at the 1980 coup. Talk about a coup. There was a coup. There were lots of people after the coup, during the coup, were killed. And the military really took control of society. And you can argue quietly and without using your name, you can argue that the 1980 coup was something that made the threshold of 2015 possible. Because people had a memory of just how bad it could get when you had military control of society. And they didn't want to do that again. So there was a kind of threshold. I remember sitting there watching, MSNBC, CNN, during the coup and wondering where my colleagues were who headed up SETA and if they were okay, and thinking, this isn't going to work. You just had a feeling, even from the moment it started, that this wasn't going to work. And I sat there and thinking, as I did about the Newburgh Horatio Gates kind of mutiny, what are you thinking? Why would you do this? It's just not going to work. And it didn't, because Turkey itself had changed, and the reason it had changed was because of the serial interventions of the Turkish military and Kemal's kind of idea that the Turkish military could be a modernizing force in Turkey. It has been that. Turkey is a modern country. They don't need coups any longer. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Mark. I have a couple questions, but I'd like to collect some questions as well. So, do we have any questions from the audience so far? Sure. Just wait for 1 second.
Robert Friedman from Johns Hopkins. I appreciate what everybody said, and it makes a lot of sense. But the sledgehammer and some other cases that people are unhappy about indicated that the regime of Erdogan was not the democratic government that you all have been talking about. The sneaking of arms into Syria, the police finding them, and all of a sudden the police being arrested. This is not the way a democratic regime works. So I'm not saying that the coup people in 2016 were justified. All I'm saying is I wonder if what you've portrayed as such a strong democratic regime is really the case.
Could I just quickly, you remember President Nixon invaded Cambodia in 1970 without, I don't see much difference between Nixon invading Cambodia and Erdogan tinkering around in Syria. I don't see much difference with Nixon and his intrusive surveillance on civilians in our country, different from what some of the AKP MIT has done in Turkey. And I love Mark's ending. It's a different country. There are 6 ways to Sunday to have democracy. Britain's democracy is different than ours, and I'm not trying to be flippant. But Turkish democracy is maturing. It's different today than it was 10 years ago. It will be different 10 years from now. democracies, it's a transformative transition. It's never the same. Our democracy today is different than when our Constitution was written. So I get it that Erdogan is not, he's not my favorite guy. I think he's an important guy in Turkish history. I think he's an important guy because he's transforming the society, moving toward democracy. It doesn't fully meet our litmus test as Americans. It works for Turkey. He's a legitimately elected. I think these are fair and free elections. You can make a case with journalists are in jail, but this is a legitimate government. And I'm not happy with everything he does, but it won't stay this way. It's going to be different in the same way our government is changing. So, colleagues?
Sener,
Sure, brief.
but I'm not sure if the audience understood the specific reference you made to
Sledgehammer.
the, no, not the sledgehammer, but there was an incident, basically. There was an intelligence operation that was stopped, publicized by another group within the government, and that's the reference to the trucks, I think.
See.
Maybe
So,
you can say something.
very brief answers. I believe both Sledgehammer and Ergenekon are dropped, and the charged are acquitted. So, most of the judges who pursued the Sledgehammer and Ergenekon are now arrested as being part of the Gülenist conspiracy. So, in retrospect, in a way, the mistakes have been acknowledged in the sense of dropping the accusations and including İlker Başbuğ and many other high-ranking generals who were briefly, some of them for somewhat longer periods of time, arrested are acquitted. But the bottom line is even the worst democracy is better than the best of military dictatorships. And there, the 1980 military coup is a recent memory for those who lived through it. 600,000 people were arrested. That's when Turkey's population was almost a quarter of today. So that's like arresting more than 1%. That's like arresting more than 2-3 million American citizens. Right? Hundreds died in torture, thousands disappeared, thousands in extrajudicial killing over the 15 years of emergency from 1984 until 1999. So compared to these mass atrocities of the 1980 military dictatorship, for those who remember that dictatorship at least, is a useful kind of warning against military meddling in politics. And Turkey is the oldest competitive multi-party regime in the Middle East. And it's not just 1950. Turkey had multi-party government in 1908, the constitutional revolution, where Armenians and Greeks and Jews and Muslims from Albania to Basra, from Yemen to basically Macedonia were represented in a multi-party parliament in Istanbul. So that's 110 years of competitive, and some parts of the Middle East haven't seen such a competitive election since the Ottoman election of 1908. So that matters, right? This is not, I don't want to dismiss any post-communist country, so I won't name any, but this is a very long, so you can find in Turkish towns people who can say my great-grandfather was with the Republicans, CHP, versus with the Democrats, right? So you have intergenerational lineages of people who are partisans of one side or the other, and you need that. This is what we don't have in Russia, for example. Still, very quickly, you have the consolidation of a one party. Not the Communist Party now, Yedinaya Rusya, the United Russia, and in many other post-communist countries. Whereas in Turkey, you have a healthy bipolarity, bi-party, at least two major parties now, even four of them consolidated. I'd like to agree with Dr. Erickson, but amend it in terms of the Second Republic. I think it's the fifth, in the sense that, since we number the republics on the basis of the new constitutions they establish, the first one in 1980, the national struggle, the National Convention established it, but that was abrogated in 1924 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and a new constitution, and a new parliament, and new cadres came into play until the 1960 military coup, which completely overhauled the system. again, which would be the Third Republic with the Supreme Court, autonomous institutions like TRT, Turkish History Association, etc. But the Third Republic, if we go with that numbering, was also overthrown in the 1980 military coup, which established yet other institutions and other. So in a way, this one, and I like the Fifth Republic title also because it's similar to the French one, which is the original that Turkey copied in terms of its secularism and nationalism. And I won't dwell on it because we don't have time, but one can draw comparisons between Charles de Gaulle and President Erdogan in that sense. A combined military political crisis over Algeria, domestic, leftists, Soviet subversion, French Communist Party being fifth column, all kinds of major internal and external military and political crisis, leading a failed coup of the secret army organization and Algerian generals, right, OIS, had a failed coup against the French Republic. And then that was the end of the French Fourth Republic and the Fifth Republic. Out of political and military and societal crisis came out the Fifth Republic. That was the title of my Daily Sabah article right after the election, Turkey's Fifth Republic. In some senses, this could be Turkey's Fifth Republic, except, of course, de Gaulle was himself a general. But
Mark,
thank you.
Mark,
See, Dr. Friedman? Sir, I acknowledge your point because I'm faced with this kind of theme all the time. People kind of look at me and say, so Erdogan's dictatorship doesn't bother you. And and that's not true. The serial increase in presidential power in Turkey is bothersome. And I think we have to debate it. I don't think it's fatal to US-Turkish relations, which is our primary focus. It's an internal Turkish matter. And I, like my two colleagues, and especially Dr. Erickson, I say, well, bad as it is, it's not Cairo. No, it's not, and what is it that you're arguing? Are you arguing that what needs to happen to end Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism is to launch a military coup? So here we are. We're in a very uncomfortable situation of supporting a democratically elected government, albeit one led by a person who has clear authoritarian tendencies, in my humble opinion, and it's uncomfortable. I agree with you. But what are we to do? Well, here's an idea. Let's butt out and hope that Turkey's complex and often violent history reverts to a more standard civilian-led, fully democratic, stable, economically positive environment. That's what we do, we hope.
Yes.
My name is Gökhan Koskun from INTED. I want to quick point make the position. There is a calling second Republican. I think Turkey right now, it's not stage of the second or third, still remain in the first Republican stage. Maybe it's different stage. There is a third stage, second stage, but I don't think it's called Turkey is second or fifth Republican right now. It's only one Republican established. And I don't think Kemalism or Atatürk's position changing as of today, because if you look at the history, Atatürk established one of the democratic system in Turkey. And President Erdogan exactly saying the same things or trying to merge the country to the same direction what Atatürk did.
Do you have a question?
The question is, especially for the US-Turkey relationships, there is still one poison standing between those countries, Fethullah Gülen organization. Every day, almost every hour, using US constitutional organizations, media, even NBA, one of the great value, by saying there is a dictatorialships in Turkey. I don't see any evidence or the development that U.S. authority or community trying to say something against this organization or enough something happened. Is there any suggestion what U.S. community or authority can take better action in order to stop this poisoning between this country relationships?
I want to collect a couple more. Was there a question here? Or yeah, here. Nina and in the back.
A question, I'm sorry I wasn't here to hear your whole comments, Professor Erickson. But I wonder of your statement that Turkey is going in the right direction. Democracy has a certain number of values. One of them is freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, freedom of assembly, an independent judiciary. I see those eroded sharply. If you criticize Erdogan, you could be in jail. I think on Sunday when Erdogan took over, 3 media organizations were put either under his command or were completely, how should I say, restricted. You have 120, I don't know, maybe Mark, 200 journalists in jail. That's not democracy. And I'll go back to what's going on over here. When the president criticizes the media, that's a very, very dangerous situation. And I think that's the case in Turkey. So I don't agree with you that Turkey is going to a better direction. I do agree that civilian command of the military is very, very important. And I'm glad to see that's happened. Thank you.
You were saying on this in this regard, but anyway, hold on. In the back, yes. Then direction.
Perhaps you've read about the NATO displeasure with the purchase of the S-400 anti-aircraft system. And I wondered, was there any other competitive bid for this system? Somehow NATO decided that the NATO systems were not to be sold to Turkey. But I wondered, do you have any explanation for all this? And was there any other system that they could have purchased?
Do we have, yes, right there in the middle, Nina.
I've just a minor question about the democratic values. I believe that President Erdogan was very upset with some of the European countries that didn't allow him to campaign during the election for the out-of-country voters. Doesn't this show that we've got problems with democracy everywhere if you want to start criticizing who's democratic or not? What's your take on that?
Thank you. So this Gülen question, does anybody want to address that?
Yeah,
Yes.
Comparative history is a value here. Abraham Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus. Suspends the writ of habeas corpus. Woodrow Wilson allows Germans in New York City to be subjected to being put in jail illegally. FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, puts 100,000 Nisi Japanese in internment camps. We know about Richard Nixon. There's a sine curve for democracy. And I have faith that democratic values are enduring throughout the progress of history. I agree with everything people have said about President Erdogan, but I think 20 years out, 30, he won't live forever. Who follows? Where does Turkey go? These are interesting questions. Exactly we don't know. So I have faith in the values. I have faith in the historical sine curve of democracy as well. On the S-400s, the NATO default for high altitude long range systems are Pershings. We won't sell Pershings to the Turks for political reasons. The United States tries to intervene over and over and over in Turkish domestic politics. We've done this in Cyprus. We've done this with the PKK in the 90s. We continue to do it today with the Christian pastor in Izmir with the Pershing missiles. America intervenes. Our Congress and our leaders intervene over time a lot in Turkish history. They wanted Pershings. We wouldn't sell them Pershings. We attach strings. You know, if you take the Pershings, then you got to do this, this, and this. And alternatively, the Turkish General Staff looked at the Russian S-400 system. They also looked at the counterpart Chinese system. And there's a tipping point a couple of years ago where they're this close to buying the Chinese system, but they finally go with the Russian system. Why is the Russian system attractive? It's powerful. It's good. It's a well-constructed system. It's not compatible with NATO. Why would Turkey buy it? Well, one, because they can, and number two, because the financial incentives offered by the Putin government are very attractive. The loan to buy, it's essentially a loan to buy the system. The payoff is pushed way into the future. Mm-hmm. So it's very attractive for the Turkish government to look at the S-400s. It fills a need.
It was just announced, by the way, Turkey is in talks now official with the US over purchasing Patriots as well. Because Turkey discovered with the Syrian conflict that it didn't have air defense systems. So that's why the push towards Mark is.
It's just interesting to me that the more the United States leans into listening to Turkey's complaints about our support for the Kurds, the more we seem capable of compromising on that and kind of acceding to their worries, the less interested in the S-400s the Turks become. So the S-400s are a way of kind of signaling to NATO, and particularly the United States, that Turkey has other options besides us. And so we kind of nod and say, yes, you do. And by the way, we don't like the Kurds any more than you do. And they go, well, we don't really like the S-400s. I mean, there's a little dance here. If I could go to Gulen, I don't really know anything about this Gulen Erdogan thing here. But I say that, I know a little bit.
We know that you do, Mark.
We are, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, we are a nation of laws. We are a nation of laws. If Turkey wants Gulen to come back, there are legal mechanisms in place to effect his extradition and return him to Turkey, where he would be put on trial kind of in a rival 1938 show trial situation. Is that really what's going to happen here? Is that really what Turkey wants? Or would it prefer to have Gulen remain here so that Gulen can kind of be a punching bag for anti-Americanism and Turkish nationhood and Erdogan as the savior of the republic? And how difficult might it be to prove Gulen's role in the July 15th coup, which is probably less of an open and shut case than many people would want, not to mention the 2,000 to 20,000 members of the press who would be reporting on such a trial. So I hear the Gulen complaint from Turkey. And I'm a little skeptical about it. What's wrong with leaving him in Pennsylvania? And come on, really? So, and everyone bangs on the table, the Turkish government bangs on the table, Erdogan bangs on the table, and always it seems prior to a meeting with the head of the European Command. So I look at the Gulen kind of claim and the subsequent maneuverings around it with a wry smile and put it down to politics.
Sener.
I have follow-ups on both of these questions. On the Russian dimension, I won't say anything else because I already mentioned what probably motivates the rapprochement with Russia and S-400s. I completely agree that it's kind of diversifying the portfolio just in case things go bad. On comparisons with first of all, there is intragovernmental disagreement in the United States about Gülen, right? He is being investigated by the FBI for embezzlement, tax fraud, visa fraud. They've issued more H-1Bs than Google, and so on and so forth. Whereas the CIA seems to think, at least that is the impression we get from the detailed reports in the New Yorker, Turkey's 30-year coup, etc., that maybe the CIA thinks it's still an asset, the Gülen networks in Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and whatnot.
Yeah.
So that's I guess a decision that the U.S. Itself is struggling with. But when I think of the Öcalan case, which I followed very closely in 1998-99, when Turkey pressured Syria to surrender, to push Öcalan, the leader of PKK, from Syria, Syria did it. That was the spring of Turkish-Syrian relations. Öcalan immediately went to Moscow because historically Soviet Union and the Russian Federation supported PKK and Kurdish socialist separatism and terrorism for decades. But Moscow, despite the unanimous vote of Duma, the lower house of the parliament, to give shelter to Öcalan, the executive intervened and they pushed Öcalan out of Russia, out of Moscow, and then he went to Italy and Kenya and Tanzania, and he was arrested there. And that also was a turning point in Turkish-Russian relations when Moscow, the first address, the first capital that Öcalan went after Syria, rejected Öcalan's request to remain in Russia. That was a strong signal and taken as such, I think, a positive signal by the Turkish policymakers that, look, Russia no longer is going to support separatism, violent insurgency, terrorism in Turkey, and then Turkish-Russian relations went skyrocketed. The chiefs of staffs started visiting each other starting in 1999, military cooperation, geopolitical cooperation, all kinds of, so one scenario is that, right? I mean, if the United States does or can, within what is possible, what Russia did in 1998, I don't know if
Öcalan is in jail today because of the United States of America. That's why he's in jail.
Yes, that is correct, and that could. So I mean, so that scenario. So and
Not Russia.
yes.
By the way, the S-400s come with Russians.
That's true. But what I'm
Want to
saying
buy
is,
S-400s? You got to take Russians.
what I'm saying is that alternatively, if the Russian government decided to give shelter to Öcalan in 1998-99, Turkish-Russian relations would be nowhere where it is today. They didn't do that because they were making a conscious, very deliberate, public and publicized kind of geopolitical decision signaling to Turkey. I am all in
It
favor
had
of
nothing to do with their opposition to terrorism.
It did, but so and so is United States and Turkey and Russia. All of them are opposed to terrorism, but still, I guess I have already said and wrote that under a state of emergency, one does not expect, a progress in democratization. That is what, neither in the transition to the French First Republic, neither, at the very end of the American Civil War. This is a period of turmoil. So I hope and I am optimistic that state of emergency will be removed very soon. It might be a nice surprise if it happens even this week. And that's going to change many things.
Expiring on
yes,
Wednesday.
so if it's not renewed, we might actually see that, again, upswing in democratic reforms, hopefully, starting very soon. And another optimistic note is that overwhelming majority of the people are charged, undergoing trial, but not sentenced, right? So so they may be acquitted, many of them may be acquitted. Of course, the condition under which, the trials go during a state of emergency, that the trial is under arrest, is not something preferable, right? You would rather have people tried while they are not under arrest. All of these I agree with, of course, but that is a very unfortunate consequence of a state of emergency. And democracy is relative within, so when we are comparing, Turkey is going forward, backward, worse, better, compared to what, 1990s? Is it worse than 1990s? I mean, it's really, I don't think so. I don't think it's, having experienced 1990s quite a bit, lots of extrajudicial killings of civilians and whatnot. And compared to what challenges it faced, if either PKK in its attack in 2015 or the Gülenist coup plotters in their attack in July 15, 2016, if either one of them, the most organized two violent organizations, if either one of them succeeded, Turkey entirely, with the Gülenist coup, or at least its Kurdish regions under the Kurdish socialist PKK, would come under basically a one-party dictatorship of a cult leader. One of them is an esoteric messianic religious cult. The other one is a self-identified follower of the Bolshevik Revolution with a Leninist party structure, PKK, PYD. So when those are the alternatives, and those are the most organized, violent, active alternatives, it seems like defeating those worst options first is a necessary precondition to open it up again to diversity. And my trust is again with 110 years of multi-party politics. I will, even when I visit, moderately tiny Turkish towns of 2,000 people, I see 2, sometimes 4 major party chapters there. Many of them have been going on for many, many years, and this is a precondition. I mean, as long as we can keep Republicans and Democrats, the CHP and the AK Party, as well as the nationalists and Kurdish socialists, as 2 or 4 corners of Turkish public political life, that's going to give us a base to bounce back to a pluralistic multi-party.
Well, it's very tempting, of course, to gear towards the issues that Washington is most concerned about in this panel, but I want to invite you all for the second panel in the afternoon, where we'll be talking more specifically about the impact, the legacy of the July 15 attempt on the U.S.-Turkey relationship. From the panel, just if I may, I feel like the centrality of the people's sort of resistance to this coup attempt needs to be highlighted. It's not, we tend to focus on the leadership, Erdogan did this, Erdogan did that. But that night he made a call, but people responded. And that's very unlike Turkish people's behavior in the previous coup attempts or soft military interventions, etc. So that's why I thought Dr. Erickson's point about that was important. I wanted to just highlight. But anyway, I want to thank my panel very much. We touched upon many issues. Hopefully we'll continue some of the discussion in the afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us to listen to this panel.